obviously, I'm going to have to stay close in terms of my reporting and observing to the government's continued negotiation with America on a trade deal. Keir Starmer, his ministerial colleagues, Johnny Reynolds, do believe that they've made good progress on a trade deal, and they do believe that if they ever get this trade deal, it would lead to a reduction in tariffs imposed on the UK. What is unclear to me is that I could sort of see circumstances in which Trump would agree to reduce the tariff on motor cars from 25%, the tariff on steel from the 25%. What is less clear this moment is whether the 10% baseline tariff on everything is negotiable. Because one aspect of all of this that we haven't talked about is that America, Trump, believes he needs the tariff money. And he needs the tariff money because he wants to give big tax cuts to American citizens. For example, there are some tax cuts, very significant income tax cuts, that he put in place during his first term in office, which are due to expire in the next year or two. He wants to extend those potentially forever. It's very, very expensive. It costs trillions of dollars to do that. And when you add the other tax cuts that he's been promising, such as exempting overtime and tips from, tips for people who work in hospitality from tax. Again, all of this stuff is really expensive and they haven't got the money. So to avoid further shock to the value of the dollar, a further risk that US interest rates will rise very sharply, he has to raise money, and his preferred source of money is tariffs. So I'm just not clear whether that 10%, which Trump said yesterday is the minimum he's imposing on any country anywhere in the world, is up for negotiation anytime over the next few years, because he needs that revenue. But let's just give the British government the benefit of the doubt that it is worth continuing this negotiation. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say, maybe they'll be able to get the motor car tariffs down. Maybe they'll be able to get the steel tariffs down. I don't know about the 10%. The thing that is also deliberate in what Trump is doing is he wants us all to play a game of beggar my neighbor. What do I mean by that? He benefits when every country negotiates individually to improve their competitive position vis-a-vis America. He gets stuff out of it for America, but also what he sets up, which suits him, is tension with our other trading partners. So if you had a situation where Starmer gets a way better trade deal, let's say, with America than the EU does, at that point, international businesses this might be good for Britain in the short term, they might start to invest more in the UK. You might get more manufacturing jobs, let's say, in the UK. But, of course, our nearest trading area neighbour, an incredibly important market to us, the European Union and its single market, at that point, they would regard the UK as trading with an unfair advantage. And the thing that I'm really worried about that Trump has potentially kicked off is not just retaliation by the rest of the world against America, but potentially a trade war between those of us who think of ourselves more as allies. Because you can absolutely envisage a situation where the European Union would look at the UK and think, well, they're sucking up in a way, UK, Starmer's sucking up to Trump in a way that is actually relatively damaging our car manufacturers, for example. And so you could see circumstances in which the EU says, okay, well, we're now going to slap more barriers, maybe higher tariffs on UK exports into the EU. And we've just got to avoid that global game of beggar my neighbor, which suits America at all costs, which is why I have been saying now for weeks that the rational response for countries like the UK is to form an alliance with other democracies that believe in free trade. Because if you had British alliance with the EU and with Canada and with Australia and with Japan and with South Korea, now you have to say, given the big tariffs they've slapped on India, you could see India coming into a coalition of this sort. A group of countries that would respond in two ways. One is they would say explicitly to Trump that we would have a unified retaliation. So if he's imposing a tariff of X, we would impose a tariff of 2 or 3x on all American exports into our newly combined region, which would terrify American companies. And at that point, if they're thinking about expanding their operations in America, they might think twice and consider expanding their operations, in the UK or in the EU or in Canada, if we've got this unified trading area. And the way to make the trading area even more attractive to those international businesses, American or any business, is also then to bring down the trade barriers between us and actually create a bigger free trade area. I mean, the European Union is already roughly the same size, its single market, as the American economy. So it is, even though it's not growing fast enough, it's a really important market to any exporter of any nationality. But if you were to create a freer trading area that included also the UK and Canada and South Korea and Japan and even India, at that point, you have a dynamic area, and that's where companies will want to invest, and not in America. My own view is you probably wouldn't even have to put all of that into effect. The mere threat of it, if it looks realistic, I think would generate so much pressure from companies in America, from consumers in America, that I think Trump would have to back down. At the moment, we're not in that space where it looks likely that he is going to back down in the short term. He is doing this pernicious thing of negotiating with each of us separately, dividing us and therefore ruling us. If we continue down this path, that is the worst outcome for the whole world. There is a final point that I need to make, though, which is the one thing I would caution against is dismissing the sort of underlying diagnosis that Trump has made completely out of hand. It is true that if you look at the dynamism and growth of the American economy over the last 15 years compared to the stagnation in living standards in the UK and Europe, America does look like a great success story. And so you'd ask yourself, why on earth is he behaving like a victim? Why on earth is he, launching this economic war against all of us? But in America, there has been a trend over the years, which we've also gone through, which is, millions and millions across the world in the richer economies of fulfilling manufacturing, higher skilled jobs have been wiped out by globalization, shift of manufacturing to places like China. It's partly why we had Brexit in the UK. It's partly why we've seen the rise of reform in the UK. It's partly why we've seen the rise of the far right across Europe. There are other factors too, but this has been a big driver of it. And so with all of this, while taking the view, which I think is reasonable, which is that this assault on the prosperity of other countries, this assault on free trade is bad for everybody, Western leaders do have to think about the legitimate concerns of the millions of people who lost their jobs during globalization and how, through training and through investment, those people can be given hope again. This is, I would argue, Trump's method is not the way to do it, but there is a legitimate grievance that millions of people have. This is definitely not the end of the story. I've talked about Britain trying to negotiate a trade deal. There will be retaliation. There will be retaliatory tariffs put in place by the European Union. There will be retaliatory tariffs put in place by China and possibly by other countries. But even in the case of China and the EU, you can expect over the weeks and months to come negotiations to try and bring all of these tariffs down a bit. So this is the start of an exhausting and painful process. This is another example of somebody like me being confident that what Trump has done is important, and changing in a really fundamental way the rules of how, whether it's the global economy or security alliances or the rule of law have operated since the Second World War. This is mega, big stuff, tearing up those rules. Where eventually we get to, there's still enormous uncertainty. And it's why it's both a very fascinating time to be doing what I do, but also exhausting.